making recommendations for repair. Next slide. So the question is, why is California leading the nation on this issue? Let me recite some history. The Civil War ended in 1865, but about 5 minutes after Robert E. Lee surrendered, the South was determined to reinstate laws and ways as close to slavery as possible. And no wonder. For 246 years, the U.S. had built one of the most profitable enslaved labor economies in the world. The U.S. enslaved population was almost 4 million, and cotton was the economic engine that powered the entire country. Every sector of white society benefited from, participated in, or was complicit with slavery, including most every major Christian denomination, colleges and universities, plantation owners in the South, and businesses, industrialists, banks, insurance companies, lawyers, and big and small businesses in the North. Next slide. The nation's constitution protected slavery and gave southern states outsized political power. Half of the nation's pre-Civil War presidents were enslavers while in office. More than 1,800 congressmen representing 37 states once enslaved black people. At the end of the Civil War, Congress seized land from wealthy Southerners, intending to distribute 40 acres to each formerly enslaved person to establish the means of economic self-sufficiency. In January of 1865, 400,000 acres were deeded to 40,000 formerly enslaved who settled on and worked the land from South Carolina to Florida. But, next slide. But by April of 1865, a mere 4 months later, Lincoln was assassinated. Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency, declaring, "This is a country for white men, and by God, as long as I'm president, it shall be a government for white men." Johnson rescinded the land reparations program and ordered the black settlers to leave their land. Land reparations was scrapped in order to assure peace among the states, but at an incalculable long-term cost to formerly enslaved persons. During that 12-year post-Civil War period known as Reconstruction, Congress tried to give newly freed black Americans basic civil rights like the right to vote. Next slide. But white Northern support for Reconstruction soon collapsed, and to resolve the contested presidential election of 1876, Republicans and Democrats cut a deal to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction. States, including California, passed literacy tests, poll taxes, and created other devices to prevent black Americans from voting. In 1867, black turnout was 90% in Virginia. After Virginia's voter suppression laws, black voters dropped from 147,000 to just 21,000. Next slide. These restrictions secured the power of white politicians, allowing them to block hundreds of civil rights laws, and well into the 20th century, excluding black Americans from the country's most important rights, such as Social Security and labor law protections. Next slide. And racial terror followed. This slide depicts the front page of the New Orleans State's newspaper, June 26, 1919, blaring the headline, 3,000 will burn Negro, with subheadline, John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 p.m. this afternoon. While lynching is often portrayed as torture murder perpetrated by a few, many were highly advertised public events attended by thousands as a means of enforcing and normalizing the social order. There were more than 6,500 lynchings nationwide between 1865 and 1955, and that is most certainly an undercount since many were not documented. Next slide. We think of California as being an enlightened state, but while California entered the Union in 1850 as a non-slave state, it was plenty complicit with enslavers entering California and bringing their human property with them. This slide depicts 1850's announcement of Negro for sale on Saturday, June 26th, I will sell at public auction a Negro man. Historians estimate that there were upwards of 1,500 enslaved people brought into California during the gold rush of 1849. Next slide. California's anti-slavery state constitution meant little because it was not a crime to keep someone enslaved in California. Here's an 1852 San Francisco Herald newspaper ad offering a $100 reward for recapture of a runaway from Mrs. Elizabeth Ware of a black girl named Hagar to be delivered to the hands of the sheriff of San Francisco. From 1852 to 1855, our legislature passed fugitive slave laws, allowing persons escaping enslavement to be chased down and sent back to the South, even though they had been living in the free state of California. In 1850, California banned black people from testifying against white people in court, including in fugitive slave law cases. 2 years later, the California Supreme Court likewise barred Chinese Americans from testifying against whites. The result, white people could commit crimes against black and Chinese people with impunity. Next slide. And much of Jim Crow found its way into California. Democrats rose to power in 1867 by vowing to fight against any new law that would make black, indigenous, or Chinese people equal to white people. At that time, there were few black people in the state, so hate groups mainly terrorized Chinese communities, and the law did not protect them. Between 1855 and 1935, 352 lynchings took place, including of 8 black Californians, but mostly persons of Chinese, indigenous, and Mexican descent. Next slide. White supremacy groups flourished in the West. By the 1920s, California became known as a strong Klan state, with sizable chapters emerging in San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, Fresno, Riverside, Anaheim, Sacramento, and San Jose. Next slide. During much of the 20th century, federal, state, and local government officials working with private individuals actively segregated America. Next slide. When you compare the redlining maps of the 1930s, and this one is of Oakland, through the 1970s, created by lenders to exclude black Americans from accessing federally insured loans, and you compare those against today's pre-gentrification maps of the most ultra-segregated, the most impoverished, the most polluted, the most underserved communities, they align exactly. The discrimination of the not-so-distant past, in fact, created our present. Next slide. The Federal Housing Administration helped millions of mostly white Americans buy houses, creating America's middle class post-war, while refusing the same opportunity to black Americans. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in federally insured cheap loans, 98% of which went to white Americans. Just one of a number of huge transfers of wealth to this population. Next slide. California was a leader in racially exclusionary policies. By the 1940s, 80% of the homes in Los Angeles contained racially restricted deed covenants, barring black families. And when black families moved into white neighborhoods, resistance followed. This 1952 photo depicts LA neighbors William Bailey and Roger Duncan amidst the rubble of Bailey's bombed-out living room. Duncan's home was also bombed. Next slide. City officials zone black neighborhoods as commercial or industrial, regardless of their residential character, thereby enabling polluting industries to locate there, lowering black American property values while enhancing the value of white neighborhoods. Next slide. The construction of freeways, bars, subways, polluting industries, commercial and residential developments and parks, all of which enhance the productivity and wealth of the entire region, were often routed through black neighborhoods, destroying their homes and businesses using the legal tool called eminent domain. enabling government to expropriate property for a price dictated by government. The slide depicts the destruction of black-owned homes and businesses in Oakland to make way for I-980 bisecting the city and walling off Black West Oakland. Next slide. One study in 2007 found that between 1949 and 1973, there were 2,532 eminent domain projects in 992 cities, resulting in 1 million people being displaced, 2/3 of whom were black. In 1956, so-called urban renewal policies enabled San Francisco to condemn and tear down the Fillmore district, resulting in 20,000 black San Franciscans being displaced and 883 black-owned businesses destroyed. 10 years later, the city would likewise condemn and raze Japantown, reducing it from 44 blocks to 4. Next slide. So on January 31, 2024, 12 legislators of the California Legislative Black Caucus introduced 14 reparative bills in education, civil rights, criminal justice reform, healthcare, and business. 10 of them, before August 31, were sitting on the governor's desk awaiting signature or veto. Approximately 7 actually have been passed, indicating that there's progress here. Advocates view this as a first step in an approach spanning years in good economies and bad to address harms literally centuries in the making. But the backlash has been swift. Next slide, please. Right-wing pundits immediately condemned, ridiculed, and were dismissive of reparations. Next slide. As we remember the image of Confederate flag-toting insurrectionists smashing their way into the Capitol, longing for a racialized social order that should have ended with the Civil War, we realize the values of 1619 that propped up the institution of slavery still impact the nation today. Next slide, please. Reparations critics pander to this backlash, stoking economic anxieties, fears of unfairness, fears of money, opportunities, and rights being taken away from one group and redistributed as a windfall to the undeserving. Next slide. What are the goals of critics in opposing reparations? There are really 3. To establish a rhetorical architecture of the argument against reparations, to stymie any political momentum, and to stop reparations proposals. Next slide. Law professor Eric Yamamoto helped design this presentation to 1, identify the most common opposition arguments, 2, parse out the rhetoric used by the opponents, 3, provide historical context, and 4, offer reasoned responses. Next slide. So the 5 most typical arguments against reparations, and I'm sure you've heard them, are 1, reparations are too late. The "it's too late" argument portrays reparations as only about slavery, and therefore a bygone era, and too late to do anything about it. Second argument is reparations are unwarranted. The "it's unwarranted" argument proclaims there's no reason for reparations, such as California was not a slave state, and that reparations is a handout for the undeserving. Third argument, reparations are too much. The too much argument casts reparations primarily as individual compensation, and therefore unaffordable, preposterous, and fringy. Fourth argument, what about other groups who have experienced reparations? Discrimination. The what about argument states that it is unfair to single out black people for reparations when others have suffered too. And the fifth argument is, it's not my fault. The not my fault argument portrays that today's taxpayers were not enslavers that should be paid to pay for the harms perpetrated by long dead individuals. Next slide. We will just dissect a Wall Street Journal editorial opinion of April 23, 2024, which contains in one hint piece all 5 objections. Next slide. Turning to the "it's too late" criticism. This one assumes reparations is for slavery, which ended a long time ago, and for which it is too late to do anything about it. Next slide. The rejoinder to "it's too late" is what began as the harm of slavery morphed through the next 150 years into its batches and its incidents, its lingering effects, too sprawling and numerous to mention in this talk today, but resulting in continuing cascading and compounding consequences today. Next slide. For example, America is as segregated today as it was in the 1940s. The exclusion from equal education, from employment, the New Deal, federally insured home loans, and other opportunities have resulted in white households having 9 times more assets than black households, black people having shorter life expectancies by almost 8 years, and in San Francisco, just as an example, for the 10-year period ending in 2021, the black infant mortality rate was 5 times that of white babies. Huge disparities persist in housing, in income, education, healthcare, rates of incarceration, and many other areas of life metrics. Next slide. Turning to the reparations are unwarranted argument. This argument declares that past injustice has nothing to do with the racial disparities today. Society is colorblind. Other groups have overcome discrimination, so black people should just try harder. Senator Tim Scott says, quote, "I am living proof that America is the land of opportunity and not the land of oppression." Next slide. This slide captures some of the data that we've already covered about how enormously profitable racial exclusion has been in the 20th century. Government policies shunted black Americans into redline neighborhoods, provided white Americans with access to cheap loans, ushering them into the middle class, while denying the same opportunity to black Americans, left black neighborhoods bereft of resources, burdened those neighborhoods by zoning them for polluting industries, freeways, and liquor stores, and designated such neighborhoods as blighted to pave the way for black-owned property to be expropriated in order to create wealth for others. And despite instances of individual black success, huge group disparities persist. Next slide. Turning to the criticism that reparations are too much. Critics dismissively declare it's all about the money, and reparations is just a windfall for people who were never enslaved. Next slide. AB 3121, the legislation creating the state task force, required us to determine economic methodologies for calculating the economic harm done to black Californians as a result of the state's racist policies. So we retained 4 economists, professors, to calculate the economic losses suffered by black Californians resulting from discrimination in such areas as healthcare, housing, and unjust property takings. I want to just add that for many of the areas of exclusion and harm, it's impossible to do an economic calculation. But for some things, you actually can, like the destruction of the Fillmore district. We know what the owners of those homes were paid. We know we have some sense of whether they were ever to become homeowners ever again. Many were not. We know what the property is worth now. So you can do an economic calculation. This was the first not only in California, but anywhere in the nation. No doubt the process of shining the light on the extent of the economic damages has triggered sticker shock, because the losses resulting from state-sanctioned racial harms are enormous. For example, if you just take one neighborhood, as I mentioned in Fillmore, where 20,000 black residents lost their homes and almost 900 black businesses were destroyed under the guise of urban renewal, which the writer James Baldwin had coined and termed Negro removal, the economic losses from that singular racially motivated property seizure easily soar into the billions of dollars. But while the task force economists estimated that actual damages for California's role in the harm are in the billions of dollars, and they broke that figure down into per individual amounts, the task force did not recommend that the state should pay that amount. City of San Francisco Commission did, but the state task force, what I was on, we did not. We shined a light on the harm, and none of our recommendations prioritized one form of repair over another. We never said that individual compensation is more important than, for example, reducing black infant mortality in California. Instead, the task force called upon the legislature to develop a feasible approach spanning years in good economies and bad, to analyze 115 recommendations and begin to legislatively address harms that had been in the making for more than a century. Next slide. Nevertheless, opponents mischaracterize the task force's work as a singular call for individual payments, fueling the clickbait sensationalism that drives news media revenues. Despite the noise, you should know, yes, the task force economists calculated actual damages of the harm and recommended generally that the legislature consider individual compensation without specifying the amount that should be paid. But the overwhelming majority of recommendations call for reforms in healthcare, in housing, in education, employment, criminal justice, and other areas. Next slide. To those who would say that reparations are too much, it is fair to ask, what is the cost to everyone of doing nothing? America has just gone through a COVID nightmare. The cost of PPE equipment, hospitalizations, the cost of developing and deploying vaccines was enormous. But what would have been the cost and lives lost in a destroyed economy to society as we know it if these costs were not incurred? Yes, the cost to repair the harms of slavery and its lingering effects in various forms is expensive. But the societal cost of ignoring these issues is astronomical, whether measured in the cost of chronic disease and shortened lives, houselessness, public safety, lost productivity and talent, intractable poverty, mass incarceration. Recall the 1970s bumper sticker that teachers put on their cars. Many here do remember this, to remind the public how important it is to financially support public schools. The bumper sticker read, "If you think education is expensive, try ignorance." Indeed. Turning to the criticism, it's not my fault. Next slide. I was not an enslaver, why should I pay? Turn to the next slide. The answer to it's not my fault is that state-sanctioned harm requires state-sanctioned repair. State-sanctioned harm, as opposed to individual acts of wrongdoing, are societal debts for which we all share a collective responsibility. And we pay for societal debts, whether or not we personally did anything to cause those debts to be incurred. Like the war in Afghanistan, that cost taxpayers $300 million per day for 20 years. We collectively pay for societal debts arising from human-caused wrongs or from natural disasters. I'm not an executive in big oil, but I'm pretty sure that my tax dollars will be paying for the harm caused by the burning of fossil fuels. Scholars Linda Bilms and Cornell Brooks argue that reparative programs to address categories of people harmed through no fault of their own are both commonplace and huge, cumulatively over time in the trillions of dollars. They include reparative programs for coal miners suffering from black lung disease, farmers whose crops have failed, workers whose companies have gone bankrupt, victims of terror and natural disasters, North Carolina, people exposed to radiation from nuclear testing, military veterans, individuals harmed by pesticides, by toxins, vaccines, oil spills, and medical devices, workers and businesses affected by U.S. trade agreements, depositors in failed banks, cash payments during the COVID shutdown. We pay for societal debts that the nation incurs now or years, decades, or even more than a century ago. For example, a 2013 analysis of federal records revealed that the government was still making monthly payments to relatives of Civil War veterans. Next slide. Opponents argue that it's unfair to single out black people when others have also suffered. This is the what about argument. Next slide. Given the atrocities committed against other people of color, including the genocide of indigenous people, it's reasonable to ask this question. While AB 3121 required the task force to focus solely on the legacy of centuries of slavery and anti-black animus, the simple answer to what about is that all state-sanctioned harms should be acknowledged and repaired, and if we can't do that all at the same time, then it should be done serially and in due course. History has shown that justice achieved by one group can set the precedent for providing justice to all groups, as in a rising tide lifts all boats. As Americans, we recognize this. We don't usually say that no repair should be made to ameliorate harm to any one group, unless we also provide repairs at the same time to all harmed groups. States that suffer devastating wildfires, like California, don't say until we are fully restored, there should be no funds for states experiencing devastating hurricanes. Most people understand that just because it may not be possible to repair all harms for all groups all at once, it should not stop us from doing the repairs we can. It should not be an excuse to do nothing. Therefore, with respect to reparations provided to Japanese Americans, to descendants of the Rosewood Massacre, to 9/11 victims, government did not interpose a condition that reparations would only be provided if it was at the same time provided to all armed groups. Next slide. The Wall Street Journal's opinion, just a few months ago, illustrates the 5 most common narratives. I'll quickly read the gist. Next slide. It begins with bad ideas never die. They go to California. And the latest is reparations for slavery. The Judiciary Committee voted to create the Freedmen's Affairs Agency to implement recommendations from the state task force. It would establish an office to determine who would be eligible for a reparations windfall. Next slide. The same committee cleared 2 other reparations bills, part of a package of 14. One bill would compensate African Americans for land taken for racially motivated reasons. The other would set aside 6% of the state budget reserves to fund reparations. Next slide. This comes up the heels of the state task force report calling for a payment of $1.2 billion for each adult. $1.2 million for each adult. Estimates reckon the cost to taxpayers would be $800 billion. California's entire budget annually is $300 billion. Last year, San Francisco's Reparations Committee submitted a plan to pay $5 million each. Next slide. There are problems of fairness. The court has barred programs that allocate benefits by race. But why should a Chinese American whose great-great-grandparents were discriminated by the Chinese Exclusion Act have to pay for what slavery did to black Americans? What about descendants of those who gave their lives during the Civil War to end the slave system? California wasn't even a slave state. Next slide. Some say reparations won't pass. Last year, Governor Newsom said he regarded reparations as much more than cash payments. In California, however, ideas once thought impossible have a way of becoming inevitable. Think free health insurance for millions of illegal migrants. Once the genealogy office identifies beneficiaries, they will become a political constituency that will lobby for this vast wealth redistribution. Next slide. Californians oppose reparations by more than 2-to-1, and not because they are indifferent to the stain of slavery, taking cash from one group of Americans who had nothing to do with slavery and giving it to the descendants of those who suffered from it would simply add one injustice to another. Next slide. Well, let's go back through this editorial and dissect its messaging, which is based upon what we've been talking about. Next slide. Look at the rhetorical framing here. The first sentence begins with a ridicule. Bad ideas never die, which serves as a springboard for the central premise of this opinion, defining reparations as being exclusively about slavery. In other words, the "it's too late" argument. And right out of the gate, this is followed by defining reparations as a windfall for the undeserving. The "it's unwarranted" argument. Next slide. By omitting the nation's history of land confiscation, by omitting any mention of the enormous profits that had been reaped by state-sanctioned exploitation and exclusion of black people, the Wall Street Journal paints a picture that compensation for land seizures is unwarranted and that budget set-asides to fund reparations are too much. Next slide. Having defined reparations as being only about slavery of the past and therefore unwarranted, the opinion mischaracterized reparations as only individual compensation, claiming that the task force called for the state to pay $1.2 million each, the too much argument. Well, we never made a recommendation that the state pay $1.2 million each, but putting aside this false statement, look what is really going on here. By coupling the "it's unwarranted" narrative that reparations is welfare for the undeserving with the figure of $800 billion, it becomes a powerful emotional trigger. Next slide. The "it's unwarranted" and "it's too much" narratives are followed by "what about?" This paragraph opens with a question about fairness, and then deploys the Asian American model minority myth to bolster the argument that black reparations are unwarranted. The opinion asks, why should a Chinese American whose great-great-grandparents were discriminated against have to pay for what slavery did to black Americans? Remarkably, in a single sentence, the opinion pits Asian Americans against black Americans and amalgamates the "it's not my fault" claim with the "what about" narrative that black people should not be given reparations when Chinese Americans have suffered too. For good measure, the opinion throws in, and California wasn't even a slave state, which is a species of the "it's unwarranted" argument. In addition to the "what about" argument that Chinese Americans have also suffered, the op-ed also asks, what about descendants of those who gave their lives during the Civil War so that black Americans could be free, implying that white Union soldiers died for black people? I guess it didn't matter to the editors that black people also fought in the Civil War, and in every war, since the founding of its nation, giving their lives to the country, despite the fact that they were treated unequally. Next slide, please. Note the trigger words that the opinion mobilizes in characterizing reparations. Think free health care for health insurance for millions of illegal migrants, which conflates the nation's border issues with Americans who have been lawfully here for centuries. Furthermore, this passage defines reparations as a, quote, vast wealth redistribution and not repairs for state-sanctioned harms and repayment of a debt owed. On the subject of vast wealth redistributions, what about the vast wealth redistribution of the Homestead Act of 1862 that gave nearly 4 million white Americans across 30 states vast amounts of federal land taken from Native Americans? What about the fact that between 1934 and 1962, the federal government had issued $120 billion in federally insured loans, 98% of which went to white Americans? What about the huge wealth transfer arising from 2.5 centuries of free labor produced by enslaved people. Next slide. The opinion circles back to where it began, closing with, "It's not my fault." The "it's not my fault" narrative, why should Americans having nothing to do with slavery have to pay for those who did not suffer from it? And it combines the "it's too late" narrative, that reparations is all about slavery, with the "it's unwarranted" narrative, reparations is a handout for the undeserving. Next slide. So if you only remember one slide from this presentation, let it be this one. Let it be this one. The history of racial exclusion is depicted as an arc of about 4 centuries, graphically showing the Black Americans as a people were longer enslaved than they have been free. Even this image is misleading in that it suggests in 1954, when the U.S. Supreme Court outlawed segregated schools in Brown versus Board of Education, it ended segregation. Well, far from it. Fierce resistance to the struggle of equal rights occurred all over the nation and continues to reverberate today. Next slide. Thank you. So I think this is the place to thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Are there a few questions that we might take while he's here? You got to get all the information you can from them. It's a lot. It's a lot. Any questions?
Well, thank you. I learned so much in your presentation, and I thank you for being here and sharing it with us, and I hope it gets shared very broadly. It seems like the media has been complicit fully in misinforming us about reparations, and that has shaped public opinion against it. Has any mainstream media gotten it right and told the truth of this story?
I think it's a matter of the journalists willing to take a deep dive into this. And many, the way journalism has been, has morphed is dangerous and terrible. And it's a race to get to a headline, where revenues depend on the number of clicks you get. I talked to CNN, for instance, reporters, and I said, look, the press keeps characterizing reparations as individual compensation only. Individual compensation is absolutely part of this, but it involves societal change. It's dismantling all these systems that have churned out racial disparities and recycled them over and over again. And the reporter said, I keep telling my editor this, but they like this story. And so some of it has to do with, to be honest with you, I thought I knew something about American history, thought I was really well read. Then we took a deep dive into this erased, buried, heritage that we have. And it was an eye-opener. I realized that my background on this was, not good. And every person on the task force, and they spent careers in civil rights, they learned something. Reggie Jones Sawyer, he's an assemblyman, and his uncle was one of the Little Rock Nine, that defied the governor of Arkansas. An angry mob threatened to kill them, and the National Guard, simply because they wanted to enroll in Little Rock Central High. And he said, I learned something new. I read about things that happened in California that I thought only happened in the South. And so there's a lot of education that needs to be done. I know when we first started a movement to have the government acknowledge another great wrong, which was the removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans in 10 concentration camps. That was a 20-year effort. It took a long time to educate the public. But when I first called up news desks, they had no idea this had even happened. They thought I was referring to Japanese soldiers who had been seized and were now being taken as POWs. things. They didn't know, understand that these were Americans. And if you polled people, the American public, as to whether the government should acknowledge the harm and provide a repair, overwhelmingly people would have said no. Well, why should we? And so I think this is, you know, an education process. In 1962, 63, 64, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65, if you put that to popular vote, it probably would have been voted down. And so I think this process of shining a light to do this study and to get this information out is what's needed to change the culture. And so it's one reason that I'm grateful that Calvary Presbyterian invited me to speak here. I'll talk to anybody who will listen, and even those who won't listen. Because, and to your friends, your neighbors, your family members, if you ever have this conversation, that the idea here is to give you the information to start the counter-narrative on this. That it's not as simple as people think this is to be.
We spoke about this briefly before, but I would like to enlarge that conversation and have everyone hear your response to me, and thank you very much for continuing this very important education effort. What I'd like to understand politically is what happened on August 31st at the legislature this year, when there were supposed to have been 9 bills that went to the governor's desk. I believe 7 went, and 2 were never taken to the floor so that there would be a final vote. So they were sort of halted at the end of the process, even though both houses had individually passed them. So 2 of the probably critical infrastructure bills, one about the African American Freedmen's Agency and the other on funding, an ongoing funding stream. Those 2 never got to the final vote, and 2 bills were vetoed by the governor. One was on food as medicine, and the other was on racially motivated eminent domain. And so I'd like to understand politically your analysis of what happened and what does that foreshadow for the future in California.
Yeah, I think the press and a few reparation advocates held it up as a failure of reparations. That the thing was a disaster. I don't view it that way. I don't know the answer specifically to what went behind closed doors. The 12 members of the California Legislative Black Caucus were responsible for bringing 14 bills. It's no secret, it's been publicized in the press, that the Legislative Black Caucus was split in a number of different ways. Senator Bradford submitted his own bills, which was not in coordination with the Black Caucus, and they were created, quite a bit of an uproar. The details of that, why that split happened, I don't know. And I'm guessing, again, this is just my thought, this is an extremely bad budget year. So California had to close a $40 billion deficit. And I would imagine, as in the case of every legislative year, there's a conversation between legislators and the governor in an election year, where the governor might have said, don't bring me a bill that raises these issues, that impacts all these other things. So, for that reason, perhaps those 2 bills were not brought to a floor vote, and 2 were vetoed. One I testified in Sacramento to support, which was providing a right of action to property owners whose property was seized and expropriated for racially motivated reasons. That was vetoed. And there were 1 others. But, 7 others made it through, having to do with career technical information, with healthcare, training, our training for healthcare providers, addressing implicit bias in birthing, people involved in birthing and birth health providers. There's a $12 million line item allocated for reparations without specifying what it's going to be used for. But nevertheless, it's there. 12 million pales. It's a drop in the bucket compared to the scale of the harm. But 12 million is not insignificant either. And so, the other thing is, in June 30th, we submitted our 1,100-page report to the legislature. In fairness to the legislators, they hadn't read 1,100 pages. And so they had to deploy staff to actually analyze this. Now, the report itself was the result of at least 130 people, including 30 Department of Justice lawyers, about 8 of their supervisors, 3 PhDs, numbers of university professors, historians, and staffing. So California took this seriously. The amount of money devoted behind this report was massive and unprecedented. And so if you get a chance, it's online. If you Google California Reparations Report, there's an executive summary that's a mere 100 pages. The rest of it's 1,100. But it's great browsing material. For example, the history portion, which is near 500 pages, is 13 chapters. It begins with enslavement, because this is where it all began, 1619. Then it turns to racial terror, because that's how the social order was enforced. Then it goes to political disenfranchisement, because that discusses the systems that were put in place to maintain this economic exploitation structure. Then the next chapter is segregation, because once you can dictate where people live, then everything else flows from that. Healthcare, education, employment opportunities, wealth. And so each chapter begins with what happened in the landscape of America, and then ends with California's furthering of that harm. And so, in fairness to the legislators, they couldn't digest all of this. I mean, they were really running. And the way the legislative calendar works is by October, you better know what bills you're going to be introducing. In November, they have to be in some sort of form and vetted by staff and by analysts. So I think everybody was kind of caught flat-footed. But, and on top of that, we had very bad budget years. So 14 bills were proposed. Now, a number of, I'll call it reparations light, did pass, but not insignificant. And so we're already working on the 2025 legislative year. And so the idea here is that every year this is going to be taken on in whatever, in good economies and bad, just like California deals with all the other urgencies it has to deal with. And we're hoping that this in turn spreads eastward. But as to why it's got exactly vetoed and why it didn't go to a floor vote, I don't know the answer. I think this is just sort of typical Sacramento.
I just want to offer, so the executive summary, the actual content part is only about 50 pages, the rest is all footnotes. So don't get too intimidated. It is amazingly eye-opening to read. So I highly recommend it. And it's at oag.ca.gov. So really, really recommend it and the work of the task force.
Yeah, I would just add that it contains scholarship in the latest research in the latest 5 years. So we're just learning about the Tulsa Massacre, Greenwood. And that happened over 100 years ago. That's how buried this history is. And so it's well footnoted. I stress to the drafting team that comprehensiveness is important, but it's more important to be accurate. And so everything is traced to a source. And so I think going forward, for those of us who are old enough to remember 1968, the Kerner Commission report. This is after the violence and riots happened in cities. The president created a presidential commission to study this. And the result was the Kerner Commission report in 1968. And sadly, it was largely ignored. All of its predictions turned out to be true. And the part about tracing the dots, connecting the dots between enslavement, Jim Crow, and decades of discrimination was about 40 or 50 pages. This one we produced, and it's worthy for the entire country. It's like I said, it's 1,100 pages. One of the task force members, Lisa Holden, calls it the Book of Truth.
I think you had a question back.
Yeah.
Well, just following up on the same piece, at the risk of being like those 37 states who mandate education, history education, what recommendations did you all make to get these facts, truth, occurrences, history into the public school curriculum or whatever is the appropriate place to get that?
So on each of the topic areas, including education, there are recommendations about, for example, turning that history portion of the report into a high school curriculum. And there were 2 University of California, Berkeley professors who were hired to begin that process. And so that's coming along. There are other parts of that dealing with education that have to do with school to prison pipeline and disciplinary things going on. In terms of professional schools, for example, and I talked to the vice chancellor at UCSF about the data shows that Black patients do better with Black medical providers because you understand that community and the patients feel comfortable with. So the question is how to increase the number of folks going through the pipeline. And so there are recommendations about that. But, and certainly part of it is knowledge about this history. That's certainly one part, getting this out there to the public. But there are other parts of education that bleed into these other areas too.
I want to be mindful of your time and Dawn's time, but who here learned something new today? Who here knows somebody who might be on the fence about reparations? All right, so we've got work to do, and that is your charge as we go from this place. Dawn, would you be willing to stay about 5 minutes?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm going to come up and ask you questions. Thank you all for coming and for being